And I'm Naomi Fertig. I'm a sophomore biology major, and we're both part of the company.
Despite the prevalence of TBI, effective treatments remain limited, which makes innovation across research, industry, and startups especially critical. Today, we are fortunate enough to have four leaders at the forefront of this effort. Dr. John O'Donnell from the University of Pennsylvania, Melissa Noble from New Jersey Institute of Technology, joining us online, Janet Huffman, CEO and CFO of Origenics, and Dr. Jennifer Perezzini, the CEO and founder of Innovation Labs. I'll now turn it over to the panelists so they can introduce themselves individually.
Hi, I'm John O'Donnell, research assistant professor of neurosurgery at Penn, and got to find out the right direction to face here so this doesn't do that. Better? Okay.
Thank you.
I also have a co-appointment at the VA. Like Dr. Birdie pointed out, I am representing neither of those institutions here today. I'm here as myself. I study preclinical TBI with coma in pigs and neurocritical care and recovery, and as well as some interesting tissue engineering approaches to regenerative medicine.
Hello, I'm Melissa Noble. I'm from.
Can you hear me okay? I cannot hear anything on your side, so I apologize. Okay. My name is Janet Huffman. I'm the CEO and CFO of Origenics. We're working on a drug to treat TBI. If successful, it'll be the first FDA-approved pharmacology to treat TBI. Prior to that, I have a long history in healthcare delivery system and healthcare technology platforms.
Thank you all for sharing a bit about your background. It's really exciting to have perspectives spanning research, industry, and biotechnology in one panel. To start us off, I'd like to take a step back and look at how the field has evolved. When you look back on the field of traumatic brain injuries 5, 10, 15 years ago, what has changed?
Yeah, so as Dr. Brody has stated, and I think many others before, previously, when there was a traumatic brain injury case, we'd really just focus on survival, right? And it would be a very severe case that we would look at the most obvious things like intracranial pressure, bleeding, coma. However, since then, we've really learned two major things. One, there are multiple different types of TBI, and there's a various level of severity for TBI. The other thing is we were really focused on the primary injury at first, but there's a secondary injury cascade that occurs, and we could detect symptoms much later, much after they've developed and caused disruption in daily life. And so what I see now, especially what we're doing, is looking at that secondary cascade, that injury cascade of these neuromolecular sequelae, really focused on the nitty-gritty, right? This neuromolecular changes, these receptor changes, neuroplasticity changes. And so I believe that will really benefit us in making biomarker-specific diagnostics very early on, as well as precision medications, really tailoring medications and treatments for each individual rather than a one-size-fits-all.
I could speak as far as the visual system, and it's usually a more mild TBI. But about 15 years ago, there's research out there that says, wow, vision is really disrupted by concussion. And then about maybe 10 years ago, there started being pilot research, which is usually 8 patients or less, and they're trying different treatments. What's going to work? And about 5 years ago, we started our concuss research, and we have found that we put together a protocol, and we have found that it is very effective, it is working, and you're not alone out there, and there is help.
I would agree with all of that. At Origenics, the work that we're doing focuses on a lot of the same things. I mean, there's been a lot of research into TBI in sports, military settings. A lot of that's led to better understanding of the anatomy and the physiology of an injury to the brain. We have better diagnostic tests now, better therapies, but we still don't have an FDA approved medication for treating TBI. I think that over the years, we've learned a lot about how the TBI affects you, who you are. It affects the fabric of who you are.
Was to think about maybe the top two areas. Something that's been touched on already is maybe a move toward focusing on more specific phenotypes of TBI, because it is, especially in recovery and rehabilitation after the injury, it is an enormously heterogeneous injury. No two injuries are alike, but there are some commonalities. And linking those manifestations to specific pathological correlates, and focusing in on things like traumatic epilepsy or sleep disturbances, as David had been mentioning, that you can really have an impact on, and rehabilitation can be enormously effective. There's also the growing recognition that our nihilism in a neuro ICU historically is probably a little unwarranted. That that the leading cause of death in an ICU is withdrawal of care, and it's there is often a disconnect between our critical care professionals and the physiatrist who might see long-term outcomes. There's also a very, as has been mentioned by other speakers today, a difficult time maintaining long-term rehabilitation, just financially, or getting access to that treatment where you see continued improvement throughout your lifetime. And that, as has also been mentioned, the lack of any treatment is in part due to. So when we mention that, that's a treatment specifically approved for this kind of an application. So like drugs like amantadine or prazosin or something like that that have shown some efficacy, they're already approved for something else that's specifically approved for TBI, and their effectiveness is not necessarily where you would like it to. It's not specifically designed for that purpose. But designing treatments, not necessarily just for TBI, but for TBI induced PTE, for TBI induced sleep disturbances, for PTSD associated with TBI, for long-term lymphatic impairment associated with TBI. There are a lot of different things that can be targeted that act as modifiable risk factors for outcome, continued outcome, and also for guarding against things like developing neurodegenerative disease.
Thank you all for your insight. It's really interesting to hear how much progress has been made and also where the challenges still remain. Building on that, I'd love to look ahead. As the field advances, how do you foresee changes in treatment developing? And what is important for successful collaboration between researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and biomedical startups throughout this development?
I think I sort of rambled my way into answering this question in the last question. As far as looking forward, where things may be going, I did mention lymphatics. I think is an area that we're really just starting to. I shouldn't say really. I think Mika Niedergard and Jeff Phillip have been doing a lot of work in that field for well over a decade, but we're starting to see fruit. we're starting to see studies in which, and I should back up real quickly, lymphatics is sort of the way that our brain clears out debris, extracellular debris. Uh, one of the things that is associated with developing neurodegenerative disease is a buildup of protein aggregates, like David mentioned, tau in particular. And the way that the brain clears those types of things out is through lymphatics. That's also a big part of why sleep can be so important, is because that is a time in which the lymphatic system is very active. So looking at therapeutics that can target specific modifiable risk factors, getting a little further afield, there are, again, brain stimulation, neuromodulation has been mentioned, deep brain stimulation. There was some pretty revealing work just 2 years ago from Nico Schiff's group with BDS in the central thalamus, which is traditionally that had been applied for patients in prolonged disorders of consciousness to try to improve awareness affecting the reticular activating system. But with this approach, they were applying in moderate TBI survivors with cognitive impairments, and it was very effective. And what that revealed was that underlying a lot of various higher order dysfunction can be a disorder of, let's say, activation, disorder of arousal in that reticular activating system that you have evidence of by a patient experiencing a loss of consciousness, sometimes prolonged loss of consciousness, but that pathology will not completely be healed just because they've regained consciousness. That is evidence of damage to the reticular activating system. So I see a lot more research focus happening in particular with activation and arousal, because that is something that is common among any patient who's experienced a loss of consciousness. In addition to that, we do various regenerative approaches involving tissue engineering and growing essentially in vitro implantable circuits that it's very difficult to regrow axon tracts within the brain, long axon tracts. You can regrow them and stretch grow them in vitro, the way the brain actually does it during development. That I am mentioning because that's a way far future thing, that a lot of the applications for that right now are human in vitro testings that recreate a lot of the anatomy and physiology of the brain, but in a very select manner. Things like the tissue engineered nigrostriatal pathway for Parkinson's and tissue engineered pontic thalamic pathway for disorder of consciousness are things that we're working on. I think that those sort of implantables, so those sort of prosthetics, similar to the modulation approach, are necessary in an organ that's a limited regenerative capacity, and that eventually, way down the line, that's where we're going to get to. That's where I hope when I'm done, we're ready to start those kind of trials.
Sorry, I can't see everybody, so I apologize if I'm talking over somebody else. But at Origenics, we've done a lot of research and focus on the mild concussion and capturing patients within the first 11 hours with early intervention. We're entering our phase 2A trials in Australia now, so we'll be dosing for the first time in actual concussed patients. So it's exciting for us to see where that takes us. But our drug is an intranasal delivery system. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it works to address a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today. It reduces oxidative stress, swelling, cleans up that debris field, so to speak, that occurs after a concussion. And so far has proven to be very safe. So we're excited to see where that takes us to our phase 2A trial in Australia. Following that, we'll move here to the US But we also use some of this, we were using some of the stuff that we've talked about previously around biomarkers, just identifying patients with certain biomarkers that may indicate, right, that they would suffer from long-term concussion syndrome. And could our drug potentially provide relief if we're caught early and administered? So that's the research we're doing, which is aligns with a lot of the stuff that I'm hearing everybody talk about here today.
As far as our research goes, we are starting to leverage virtual reality with vision therapy. And hopefully that will, if it takes a long time to get in to see a vision therapist or an optometrist for whatever reason, we can start using VR headsets as an interim, so you're not losing out on that 1 month that you have to wait to see the doctor. Or if you live in a rural area and you can't get to a vision therapist or you can't get to an optometrist, this will help bridge that gap. So hopefully there is no gap before treatment, and that you can start getting, the sooner you start treatment, the sooner you can get back to your daily living.
And just to reiterate, something that I mentioned earlier, which is, really getting to those neuromolecular changes as rapidly as possible after the traumatic event. And some of these changes do also happen very rapidly. And something that we're focusing on is glutamate. We see glutamate changes nearly immediately after the trauma. And this not only causes excitotoxicity and cell death, but it can also lead to the neuropsychiatric issues that we see, like PTSD, like epilepsy, things that are comorbid with TBI. And so getting to that root, getting to as close to the traumatic event as possible, I think is really key for better outcomes.
It's really inspiring to hear those visions of the future and see where the field is heading. And then to end with our questions, I'd like to bring the conversation back to the people at the very center of this work and ask how you all incorporate the lived experiences of TBI survivors and patients into your research or product design.
I think it's incredibly, incredibly important. As a preclinical researcher myself, I think that actually some of the clinical metrics don't necessarily capture a lot of the human condition, especially with mild TBI and those repetitive micro TBIs, when we really just see issues occur much later on after disruption. And so we were very fortunate to have worked with the DoD for multiple years. We were funded by multiple contracts and really getting to understand the types of treatments they want to take, the stigmas that are surrounding their conditions. It was so important to informing our path forward, especially in a world where there's so much new technology, so much innovation, and even certain treatments that require all day therapy sessions might not be as scalable as we want, might be a bit prohibitive. So always keeping the patient in mind is its key.
I always, the first question I would ask the patient as they came in for their therapy session was, what are our symptoms from 1 to 10? What are we working with today? And as they would tell me what their symptoms are, I would, gather all that information and then take our protocol and kind of cookie cutter and kind of get them into, okay, so we can do this today. This puts you a little bit hard today, but I can't be that aggressive because you came in with an 8 headache or 8 dizzy, nauseous, photophobia. That's another one where I would have to lower the lights, or I was very sensitive to people and try to take my protocol and make it just for them. And then we would get through it in the 8 weeks that I saw them. And then and they did really well with that. So as long as you keep it patient centered, I think you'll be in good shape.
At Oragenics, we've been really lucky. Dr. James Kelly is our chief medical officer. He's spent his entire career treating people with concussions, both in the NFL, the MLB, and hockey, and for the Department of Defense. So he has a long career of treating people with concussion and focus. He knows these patients inside and out. So the experience he brings to Origenics is invaluable. One of the lead scientists that helped develop this drug suffered a massive concussion. It's what inspired him to go down this path and help work on this drug as well. So we have their insights. Me personally, my husband suffered a concussion about a year ago that he still suffers from. And so as we're developing our protocols and we're working on our clinical trials, we have a lot of patient-centered experience to draw from around how we can design our protocols with that patient in mind and understand, have a deeper understanding of not every concussion is the same. Everybody experiences something different. And the way their path to recovery, which is very unique to each of them. And that is one thing that we're keenly aware of as we develop our protocols and our trials.
So, I'm fortunate to have an office across the hall from a VA physiatrist who Randy Swanson, who I get to have frequent conversations with. And in addition to that, I got into this and kind of started going after severe TBI research after undergrad because a cousin who I was very close with was in a car accident when I was in undergrad, just finishing up undergrad, and had a severe TBI, emerged into vegetative or what we're calling unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, and eventually minimal unconscious state. Eventually, he passed away in 2019 of pneumonia, which is unfortunately a all too common outcome. But that process during undergrad, when I was a biology major uh, and already interested in neuroscience, really pushed me in the direction of wanting to be able to eventually steer the ship and go back for a doctorate and be able to steer research effort, real meaning pursue funding for um, preclinical moderate to severe TBI, because that was something that in our experience with brilliant people, my cousin was treated by John White, who is an eminent uh, neuro recovery neurologist at Moss Rehab. We were very fortunate to be involved in some very cool research during that time. There is difficulty innovating without clinical research. And one of the difficulties with moderate or severe TBI is that it involves a loss of consciousness. And loss of consciousness requires inertial force injury, which is very common in human brains because we have a lot of brain mass. TBI at its core is an acceleration that produces inertia throughout the brain based on brain mass. And in a large animal model, you can scale up acceleration in order to compensate for the lack of mass and generate the same forces experienced by a human. And you see things like prolonged coma, increased intracranial pressure, these kind of things that are unique to humans and other large animals for TBI. And that involves just a rapid rotational movement of the head. That's really what it is. There's no impact involved at all. Impact is relevant. And I want to be very clear that our small animal models are very relevant, especially for secondary injury cascades. But it is fundamentally a different injury than what humans are experiencing and other changes. So that's sort of what I came back to do based on my own, I guess, not patient experience, but caregiver experience, was that there was a real lack of preclinical research for moderate to severe TBI because it was so difficult to reproduce it. And you really have to want it if you're going to put in the time to do a large animal trauma model development during your postdoc and researcher. Because as some other people can note, this neurocritical care in large animals can be very challenging to staff, um, but very important. And yeah, it's it's not always clear, especially for preclinical researchers, and a lot of my earlier research, this was true. What is the most relevant thing for a patient, or the most, even if my focus on intracranial pressure only came about during my postdoc when I started working very closely with a neurosurgeon. And that was, finding these points in reality. What are modifiable factors? What can be improved, and how do we make that better and build from there? Um, is the kind of information that you can get from interacting with patients. The VA does a very good job of it as well.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for the work that you contribute to this field. That wraps it up for our questions, but I think now we're going to open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions. So I'm just curious if they kind of navigate that relationship for agencies when trying to kind of determine what are adequate displaced efficacy and what you're expecting.
So for me, one thing in a large animal model is what you would call IND or IE enabling studies that we would perform. So at my level, it is typically making sure that we have causes ways to be good lab practice compliant, um, and start conversations early with regulatory bodies, depending on if you are at a major research university, you likely have some sort of center for innovation. We have the Penn Center for Innovation that's uh, really great for working in tech transfer. There is any what's difficult to sell to a lot of academicians is that translation often requires commercialization, and translational research beyond the point of government funded research requires that you have shepherded your IP properly, that you've shepherded your intellectual property appropriately, so that when you need investment to continue your work, beyond the bench and actually be able to manufacture and distribute or execute a larger study, that you can attract that investment because your IP has been properly handled. It's something that they can actually develop, because eventually things that we do enter into a realm of capitalism, and they need to be distributed and sold and developed further. And that does require attention, even at the level where I'm, in preclinical research.
Could you repeat that question for me? I couldn't hear
Okay.
what was asked.
Like regulatory bodies? Is that so correct?
Do you like the relationship with regulatory agencies, just given how heterogeneous the condition and patients, when you're kind of going about selecting your endpoint for showing efficacy?
So I teach the FDA regulatory class, and university. So I which they do with which is teaching scientists how to translate their work into actual practice. And with that, they have subdivisions that is called regulatory. What you do is you set up a priority success points. So what are your milestones for success? And you want to do that before your data is collected so that you build data afterwards. And then you're usually doing that based on best practices and whatever your area of research is. And I definitely pre-submission because my startup company does have FDA clearance, and you want to do pre-subs with the FDA, pre-submission meetings with the FDA, where it's conversations. This is what we're thinking of. This is what we're going to do. What do you think? Ultimately, the FDA makes the final call. And having those conversations, you set your company up for success. All right. Are there any other questions?
I think Ms. Huffman was going to speak online, actually.
So is I sounds like the question is related to the clinical development, the research and development process and life science
And
companies?
interaction with regulatory agencies.
Yes, so that is something we're in the thick of at Origenics and have been for the last couple of years. It's a daunting process. I do think that there could be a lot of improvement made with the FDA around the process to get drugs, especially drugs, to for unmet needs such as TBI to the market faster. And you do have to communicate well with the FDA. You need to make sure that all of your work that's being done is being done GMP, that it's going to meet FDA standards. It's extremely expensive to develop a drug and take it through the research and development process. And I do think there could be a lot more improvement and work done in that area. But I mean, you guys are research students. I can say we need a lot more, especially in this area of TBI. And so I'm excited that you guys are here and interested in it because there's a lot of work to be done and we need a lot of students like you to go out and do it.
There was
like research get done by like corporate entities or like academic institutions? What do you find are the principal and most useful sources of like funding? Would it be from like say medical grants, or would it be from like private investors or even venture capital, other institutions like that?
The question on funding and what are the best sources of funding in an academic or corporate setting?
It's
So
a
go ahead.
Again, we were very fortunate to get non-dilutive funding from the Department of Defense through Air Force as well as Army. But as you progress, as you get later stage and you're still pre-revenue, meaning that your product is not yet on the market, you're going to want to seek private investment and seeds as well. But there's so many different creative ways to receive funding or different accelerator programs, your early incubators, family offices, high net worth individuals, especially people that care about this condition, about TBI and about brain trauma. So there's lots of different mechanisms.
At Origenics, we're publicly traded, so we do have the benefit of using our stock and our equity to raise capital. It's extremely, like we said, extremely expensive to develop a drug. We've used research grants in the past from NIH, I believe, but most of our capital for our work does come from investors. And there isn't a single investor meeting that I sit in or roadshow that I go to or investment bank group that I sit in front of that isn't somehow or hasn't been impacted by traumatic brain injury. Most of them have played football or sports, or they have relatives that this has impacted. And a lot of investment that we receive is because they recognize the need in this area. And to previous speaker's point, they feel passionate about finding a solution to this. Most of my time is spent raising capital, to be quite honest.
Business innovation research program that spans all federal agencies, so DoD, NIH, NSF, through the Small Business Association, and there's two flavors of it: SBIR and STTR. The tech transfer one is either partnering more closely with a university or an academic institution, and the SBIR is much more centered on the startup itself. This program, we lost it for a little while this past year, but it is coming back. It is an enormous engine for innovations and economic output. You know, that program, that Small Business Innovation Research Grant Program, pays dividends. I can't remember the exact numbers. I think it's about somewhere between 2 to 3 times what is funded into the program is returned in economic output. And these span phases. You can get into clinical trials with an SBIR, but it's not enough money on its own at that point. But especially early on, if you have a startup idea, phase 1 SBIRs, they don't require that much preliminary data. You can really add it even in idea stage with just some basic legwork. You can start to pursue something like a phase 1 SBIR to get that initial, just a little bit of boost of funding to try and turn it into something real and expand it into a larger full product. And as has been mentioned, that non-dilutive funding, it can be enormously helpful in early stages of a company.
Time, but I want to thank you all for your insight and for being here today.
Thank you for having me.